really pleased.
That's cool.
Okay. Right. Okay. In our last podcast, we were talking about collective sense making, if you recall, and the tools we have to understand our world, and also the kind of sense making tools that we may have forgotten. And as with all beneficial discourse, we kind of allowed each other to riff and range on the subject. But there is still much more of that landscape to explore, I feel. And one of the regions we didn't really touch on was the coding of Judeo-Christian religion into the collective psyche and sense-making apparatus of Western culture. Now, I specifically point the question at the West, as I think I have a sense that we've more of a perception for the East in this matter. For example, look at the enforced conformity of Islam, or the insisted kind of introspection of Buddhism. These are aspects, I feel, of those religions that are still very much in play, but our own religious heritage, I think, is kind of, how would you say, is kind of fogged. I can't really work out why. So in the first half an hour of the podcast, I'd like to talk with you about how this disharmony has come about, and maybe in the latter half of the podcast, talk about the effect of such a disharmony. So, Mike, to ask you more pointedly, do you see more of a disconnect between the West and its religious heritage in comparison to those of the East? And if you do, how does this disconnect impact our powers of sense-making?
Great question. So, short answer is yes. There is more of a disconnect. And I think it's so, yeah, to answer the question briefly, and then we can drill down if you want. Yes, there is more of a disconnect. I've got some ideas as to why, that is. They aren't original ideas at all. It's like
that's fine.
It's some of it from, Roger Scruton, as a matter of fact. But yes, there is a bigger disconnect, and I think it impacts our collective sense making, or ability to make sense of the world, precisely because, well, for two main reasons. One is that, the decline of religion has caused us to try to elevate things other than traditional religion past the point where they can do any good. Like science is a good example. Scientism, right? We've, for whatever reason that we can get into, we've put religion to one side, and we've said, okay, so now science is a thing. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I really do believe that human beings are kind of inherently religious creatures. We need something to fill that kind of, to fill that slot in us. And, we're meaning-seeking creatures. We're pattern-seeking creatures, right? So, exactly. So, the fact is that religion can't tell us the things it's being asked to tell us. It can't do, science, I'm very sorry. Science cannot tell us the things we're asking it to tell us. Science cannot reassure us in the ways we are asking to be reassured. Science doesn't have anything for kind of the inevitability of human suffering. It's not designed for that. That's not a knock on science. Science wasn't designed for that. Science is a set of investigative techniques to get at the nature of empirical reality. That's all it is, right? It can't tell you certain things. It can't tell you what you should do, for example. That's, questions of should, what should we do now? Things like, those aren't scientific questions, so we're trying to shoehorn a lot of really interesting, hard questions into the science slot, and that's not working. So that causes us to make less sense. That causes things to look as if they're nonsensical. That causes us to say nonsensical things, like science has proven that you should do X. That's an inherently dumb thing to say, because science can't prove what a human being should do. It's not what science is. So that's one. And two, it has caused us to, how can I put this? Well, I read this great quote that said, tradition is a set of answers to questions that we've forgotten about. But if you get rid of the tradition, you get the problems back. Right? So, and that's kind of the situation we're in. Like there were all these stories that we told ourselves. I have to say Jordan Peterson was a big help in this, because he was kind of my gateway drug back into really taking a hard look at Christianity and you know, going back and reading the Bible and what have you. And there's so much in there that at least gives you a framework. Doesn't necessarily give you a nice kind of collated set of answers, but gives you a framework for kind of understanding certain things, certain very tough, kind of wicked human problems, right? And it's like those stories are part of our heritage and our culture for a reason. It's like you want to get rid of those stories, okay, but then all of a sudden there's all this stuff that starts to look mysterious to you, because you forgot that there was this framework for dealing with certain difficult human problems. You know, the problem of arbitrary human cruelty, the problem of resentment, the issue of why, you know, I even conservatives, I get impatient with conservatives because they're always asking me, not always, but, you know, there are conservatives who will come and ask me dumb questions like, well, how come there's so much violence in the community? Someone asked me one time, how come there's so much violence or so much conflict between black people and white people? And I said, well, even if you concede that there is, quote unquote, so much conflict between black people and white people, do you really have to go very far to ask why there's conflict between human beings? It's like, what is the first crime in the Bible? It's a fratricide. Very first thing that happened after human beings went from being on speaking terms with God in a walled garden, right? The very first thing they do when they get out, okay, one brother kills another. What was that? Was that white on black violence, black on black violence? Was it, what was it? It was, why is that story in that place in that book? You know, right near the beginning. It's because they really wanted us to know that this is very important. You have to know this about yourself as human beings. That's why that story is there. Huh? So, you know, I won't ramble too long because I know we have a lot of territory to cover. But yes, it is, there has been this alienation from that piece of our cultural tradition. Yes, it's a problem. Yes, it's more of a problem here than in the so-called East. It is interfering with our ability to make sense of the world, because we're trying to make sense of the world. We're trying to make sense of aspects of the world using tools that weren't designed to make sense of those aspects of the world. So I'll pause there.
Yeah. No, I think that's very well said. It's interesting you talk about religious stories. I've been thinking about religious stories and how I imbibed them as a young person. I didn't go to church regularly. I did have church-going grandparents, and I have an auntie who's still in the church. But certainly, in terms of christenings and weddings, and the odd Sunday school, you know, I was present, and I went to Christian schools. So we always said the Lord's Prayer. We always sung hymns. And there was a presence of Christianity that was fairly strong throughout my formative years. And the religious stories that were told, I think, to be something like you were talking about patterns earlier on, something like the encapsulation of behavior patterns throughout time. You know, we encapsulate these behavior patterns, usually the worst ones we have, and we try to make sense of why we do them over and over again. That turns into a moralistic story, and it gets hard-coded into these ancient documents. And it seems that now we've got a foolish disregard for the meaning of these stories and how they've kind of affected our forefathers and our ancestors. And I think it's kind of also remiss of us not to pay attention to how these stories have shaped us. What's your experience with how people who have had a Christian upbringing, even if it's by osmosis, in their culture, how the modern person pays attention or doesn't pay attention to the prevalence of Christianity in Western culture.
Well, it's interesting. I was listening to a Roger Scruton talk, and he used a term that I thought fit very well with a lot of what I was seeing, and probably a lot of what you see too in the West, especially among young people, among woke people, right? It's oikophobia, right? The fear.
What is that? What was that?
Oikophobia, right? So oikos, yeah. So oikos is Greek for your home, right? So oikophobia is like your fear and loathing of your own home. And I thought that really summed things up very well. I mean, this is what, and the reasons for it are something else, but certainly, when we look at, something that strikes me, for example, talking about traditions, right, is how people will certain kinds of people will jump to embrace and go out of their way to respect every tradition except their own, right? I remember over the last few years getting into arguments with progressives, lefties, whoever, where they would, and this isn't even necessarily talking about religious traditions, but just ordinary, habits and customs and what have you. They'd be trying to make some stupid progressive woke point about how, it's okay for men to walk around in ordinary life wearing dresses and what have you. And, and my point was that, I wasn't even trying to get into whether it's quote unquote okay or not. My thing is, listen, it's a norm, right? We have a norm, like in the United States, there is a norm that says in normal life, men don't wear dresses, right? Men don't wear female clothes. Well, and then they go into this whole thing. And I just pointed out to this person that, on this one occasion, I said, when you go, if you were to go to Japan or someplace like that, you go to someone's house and you take off your shoes, right? You go to Thailand and it's rude to touch a person on the head, so you don't do that. You go to India and people greet each other with a namaste, right? They put their hand. That's a big thing. There's a certain brand of lefty that just loves to go to the Orient and bow and do namaste. And the point is not that you shouldn't do that. The point is that how come in other words, when you go to Japan and you say, well, okay, we take off our shoes and we leave our shoes in the mudroom and then we come into the house and we sit on the floor and what have you, if they have a traditional thing where they sit on the floor and eat. You don't launch into this kind of grad school dissertation on why it's really okay to wear shoes in the house, or why you should sit at a table that's, quote unquote normal height, like we do in the U.S. It's, you almost, it's like, no, I'm going to respect you go to parts of Africa, rural parts of Africa, and, people will eat around there'll be a communal pot and maybe some flatbread and whatever, and everyone, and again, there's a certain kind of lefty that just loves that kind of thing. I mean, there's certain kind of lefties who don't really, believe that there are actual cities in Africa, but that's a separate matter. But you know what I mean? That embarrassment of a prime minister they have up in Canada, right? Justin Trudeau. I mean, he made a spectacle of himself going around India, doing namastes and dressing up in this, and not carrying himself like a head of state, like someone who's like, I'm representing my country and my culture. It's almost like he was desperate to lose himself in the East. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
And that, to me, that's an example of oikophobia. Again, it's not that everyone's tradition is great or everyone's tradition no one's tradition can be criticized, or that one's own traditions can't be criticized. But how come it's only your culture and your tradition that you want to be transgressive with, and everyone else's culture and tradition you can't get enough of it? Something's wrong with the way you're thinking if that's how you're thinking. And by the way, something's wrong with it not just because it bespeaks a fear or a loathing of your own home. Something's wrong with it also because it's almost like you don't see the other people, the people from whatever foreign country you're visiting. You almost don't see them as actual real human beings who might be full of it, right? Who might be just as wrong about things as you are, who might be worthy of criticism, right? We're talking about religion, Christianity versus Islam, right? Everyone's very quick, certain kind of lefty is very quick to talk about the shortcomings of Christianity and the flaws in the Catholic Church or the Church of England or what have you. And these are real things, of course. But the thing is that the Catholic Church has flaws because it's a human institution. The Church of England has flaws because it's a human institution. Every single Christian church has flaws, some more serious than others, but all of them have flaws. All of them don't work right, because they're human institutions. But somehow there is no mosque that has flaws. There's no Muslim religious school that has, but these are human institutions. And in a sense, to put those institutions beyond criticism, in a way, to me, is disrespectful to Muslims. It's not seeing them as people. You're seeing them as symbols. So oikophobia, the fear and loathing of one's own home, one's own tradition, now why does that kind of thing emerge? Well, look, I think there's a lot of reasons for it. There can be a lot of reasons for it. I think for example, if someone might have been just radicalized because they had a kind of an unhappy childhood or an unhappy adolescence, and someone approached them with some ideas that seemed to give them a lot of answers to things, and they jumped on it. I mean, that's a popular thing, right? I mean, all of us were at the point where someone approached us with some stack of ideas that seemed to answer everything, that seemed to explain everything away. I mean, I remember when I got kind of radicalized into kind of black progressivism and black nationalism, and it was like, white supremacy was the answer to so many things for me. It was like, you guys obviously are at fault for everything. It was perfect, right? And it took a while a lot of, conversations and arguments and me being just a young, dumb asshole for years and years and years until finally, I had to confront myself and say, well, you have to do better than a belief system that doesn't demand anything of you, that doesn't ask you to do anything, that doesn't ask you to shape up somehow. Whatever white people are not, or whether they are not doing, whatever they have or have not done, okay, your belief system can't really hold water if it doesn't demand anything of you, if you don't have to shape up somehow, right? So that's one. Another thing is that I think, what I'm trying to say, I think that people who had an upbringing that was unpleasant, like if you had an avowedly Christian father or mother or both, and they kind of abused their parental authority, not necessarily abused you criminally, but just, were not, they weren't, I don't know, they didn't, what am I trying to say? There's something that Christians talk about like, the Christian witness. And there's this concept they talk about, like winsomeness, like the idea being that you're supposed to show the world something. You're supposed to be a certain kind of example in the world. You're supposed to be, you're supposed to bring sweetness and light to the world. You're supposed to be the salt of the earth, right? You're supposed to add flavor to things and preserve the things that need to be preserved. There's a way that you can be in the world that show better than actually just straight up evangelizing, that just like, whoa, those Christians seem like they always kind of got it together, like, and, to the extent that people don't do that, to the extent that they simply use their power over other people, in a way that's punitive or in a way that's petty or what have you, that doesn't help. That can make the problem of oikophobia worse, because a certain amount of oikophobia, you could say, is age appropriate, is developmentally appropriate. In other words, human beings, right? We have a very long infancy and a very long adolescence, because all human beings are born premature. That's the price we pay for having big brains, right? The mature human brain is too big to pass through the human birth canal. So we have to be born premature. And even then, pregnancy is a minefield for human women. And then, as opposed to most other animals in the animal kingdom, we're helpless for a very long time. Okay. And so now, we get to the certain point and we want to, strike out on our own. We want to be independent, and that's normal. And so it's almost as if the hatred of one's home, a part of it is not, it's not personal. It's not actually directed at one's home. It's more like the hatred of one's prior situation, because you're becoming an adult and you have to, it's almost that you could almost say it's built into humans, like you want to get away from the home environment. And that may be a good thing, because what that means is human beings are more likely to scatter, to move, to not bunch up so much in one place. And therefore it increases our survivability, you might say. That's one rationale. Don't know if it's true or not, but you could look at it that way. Okay. But it's when the quote unquote hatred of one's home gets personal, when it's kind of deep and corrosive, when it's resentment of one's home, as opposed to just wanting to get away and wanting to try new things and whatever. When it's this deep, corrosive, almost personal resentment, I think very often what you find is that someone's got some issues that they need to, I certainly did, got, resentment of their parents or anger about things that happened in their childhood, what have you. People who have been abused, a lot of them tend to get very angry at their home environment, their parents, whatever, and anything that their parents embraced, anything that their parents liked or thought was good or proper. So in one sense, what we're seeing right now is you could say it's partly the result of not just the fact that Christian culture gained ascendancy, but then the stewards of that culture did not perform the proper stewardship and the proper witness in the world, okay, to help preserve that. That's part of how you preserve those traditions. You preserve them with a kind of a love and a kind of joy that shows young people, hey, this is it right here. This is good stuff right here. And if you don't do that, then that's a problem. If you to the extent that conservative Christians in the U.S. especially have thrown their lot in with established power, with right-wing Washington, for example, I think that was a mistake, because it seems to me anyway, that's not the role of Christians in the world. You're supposed to render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and render unto God what is God's. But that doesn't, you're not supposed to line up and be like rah, rah, rah behind Caesar. This is yours and this other thing is not. There needs to be a kind of a detachment there. And so to the extent that conservatives, as Christian conservatives have done that, that's been a problem, because then, when people look at the wrongdoings of government, then in addition to the wrongdoings in whatever established church you belong to, whatever organized religion you belong to, which is going to have problems because it's a human institution, now you're going to be tarred with whatever brush they tar the government with, because you have said, yeah, it's the 80s and I'm a Christian, so, Ronald Reagan is my guy. That's a problem. And then, of course, we've got the whole thing of the Cold War. You've heard my half-ass theory before that the Cold War was this crisis, this moral crisis for the West. And we dropped the ball. We won the Cold War, quote unquote, and we went around high-fiving and slapping each other on the back because we, quote unquote, won the Cold War. But in so doing, we kind of destroyed our ability to actually reason about morals and ethics. We spent, all this time saying the West is great and religion or what have you, but all we did was embrace the opposite of big socialism, which is big capitalism. And that's not really, to me, I can't see that that's a good role for Christians to play in the world. That's not, and by the way, some of the Christian thinkers I respect the most were vehemently anti-collectivist, but they were also vehemently against big capital. G.K. Chesterton is a person I'm always going on about, and he was blistering in his condemnations of big capital, of oligarchy, what have you. At the same time that he had no love for socialists, anarchists, communists, fruit juice drinkers, any of those people, vegetarians, okay, but he understood that there was a moral imperative to do more than just oppose collectivism by saying, yeah, whatever capital does is good. So that's a pretty rambling answer, but I'll pause there and we can take whatever direction you want.
That's good. Thanks. That was quite wide ranging, but some excellent points there. We may as well now, as we've explored what we see as the results of the disconnect, let's talk a bit about the results. It's like I ask myself a question and I perhaps posit the question to others, other people who have blanked their religious heritage. And that question would be, have you got something that's better? You know, I mean, Christianity, as I see it, is a structure of morality, and is a structure that's been honed and rolled across generations. And up until quite recently, relatively speaking, it's been fairly well adhered to, you know. And by the way, it also seems to me that attempts at replacing this structure with other, what do we call them, idealistic doctrines haven't been that successful.
No. Yeah.
So I wonder, is it just that now it's not socially taboo to not go to church, you know, to not exist within the function of the Christian ideal, that we have this huge drop off in subscription in Christianity? Or is it that Christianity is just so boring to the modern person, you know? Because in terms of effects of disbelief, you need not look too far for examples of anti-Christian practice. One that rings true to me is cancel culture, because cancel culture, to my mind, runs against forgiveness.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
So I'd ask you, do you think it's simply easier somehow for people to break from what they know historically is a spiritual attainment that one can achieve through kind of pitting your actions against the ideals of Christian teaching? Or is it just too awesome and frightening for the modern person to kind of measure themselves in this way?
Oh, that's a great question. So let's take that last part, awesome and frightening. See, part of the problem I really do think is that, and you know, you've heard me go on, and we've talked before about the COVID crisis and about the idea that one of the reasons for the COVID panic, right, is that people have, our societies, the ability of our societies, yours and mine, to at least grapple with the infinite things, to grapple with ultimate things, right? That we've kind of, that ability has atrophied, right? Some of that has gone away. We've lost some of it. Again, because of the decline of religion, the decline of Christianity, right? We've replaced religion with this idea that if you propitiate these dead gods, you know, of government and what have you, that you'll live forever. You will be without sin and you'll live forever. You propitiate the gods of wokeness. You make the correct ritual gestures, right? You acknowledge your privilege, quote unquote. You take the knee, okay, and you'll be forgiven. And you'll be righteous.
Well, you won't be accused.
You won't be accused, right? Because their religion has no concept of forgiveness, right? And that's what makes it, you know, orders of magnitude worse, is that it's got all the sin and none of the forgiveness. Okay. And then, you know, the COVID-19 thing, it's like, here we have a disease that, I mean, when you think about Christianity, especially the long kind of, and storied history of Christians ministering to the sick, right? And you think about what it means for us to be in a place where, you know, a kind of like a government functionary can just close down churches with the stroke of a pen. I'm talking about Boris Johnson now. Just don't go to church and do that. mean, that's like a big deal. When I was talking to Reverend to Father Franklin, Father Jamie Franklin, who does a Irreverent pod, he said this hasn't happened in 800 years in England, So
that's how little we think of the church in this country.
Well, you have to say yes, but also it's how little the church thinks of itself, how it's failed to kind of jealously guard its own prerogatives,
and how
right?
and how its flocks are not rigorous in their support.
Well, yes, exactly. Well, and look, this is the kind of thing that happens when you're not used to having to fight. Actually, Father Franklin said something very interesting. He said that he thought one of the problems was that the church, the modern, for example, he was talking as an Englishman, right? So the Church of England, that it had atrophied somewhat because it hadn't had to fight. It had kind of developed, the modern church had developed in a cultural environment that was mostly either friendly or at least not hostile to it.
Yes.
Okay. But then in recent years, something has changed, because something has changed. And now you've got this church that really does have to exist in an environment, a culture that is actively hostile to the church, actively hostile to Christianity, wants to destroy Christianity. And because the church has not kind of prepared itself, it hasn't been working out, so to speak. It's not able to stand up for itself, and that's a problem. So, let's see, but I want to circle back, because I don't want to drift too far away from your fundamental question. So we're talking about, if you could refresh my memory, we're talking about,
I asked you if a person pitting their actions against the ideals of Christian teaching was too awesome and frightening for them to countenance.
Too awesome and frightening, right? So we're talking about being able to face ultimate things. Well, religion is one of the things it is an operating system for dealing with ultimate things, for dealing with eternal things, for dealing with frightening things. There's a saying, rather, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, because whatever God you worship, if you presuppose, and let's take the most secular idea of God, which is not necessarily the God of Abraham, not necessarily Allah or anything else, but just the idea that in all your moral reasoning, there is an ultimate aim point. There is an axiom. Because there has to be, of course. There have to be absolutes. You can't do mathematics if numbers are not absolute. You simply can't. If 1 is 1 on Tuesday, but 7 on Wednesday, and maybe 5 on Saturday, okay, you can't do arithmetic. That's just how it is. So, no system of moral reasoning can be coherent unless it has some immovable fixed point. And that that fixed point, let's call that God for a second. Okay, well even that has to be a terrifying thing. Even that has to be, if you contemplate that idea, that there's some things that are always wrong. Okay? In other words, the existence of that axiom is itself a judgment. In the same way that the absolute nature of numbers is a judgment against you if your arithmetic is sloppy. I don't care how you do this thing, 2 and 2 is not going to equal 5. I'm sorry. Like, nothing you can do can change that. And again, if it's just numbers, well, it's just numbers on a page. But if it's the substance of reality, if it's how you live if there is a right way to live your life, or put it this way, there are some relatively small numbers of right ways, or there is some relatively small number of right ways to live your life, as opposed to all the ways you could live your life, most of which are wrong, then even that has to kind of give you some pause, make you think a bit. And we don't have a good operating system for dealing with eternal things, for dealing with ultimate things, for dealing with inevitable things. Okay?
Well, that's one of the things that organized religion is very good at, and that's death.
Perfect. Correct.
What would we have without the ceremony of the funeral and the eulogy?
That is exactly, and it's really, and that kind of thing, and science can't do that for you.
No.
Science can't answer the questions of where you came from and where you're going. Science cannot do that. It cannot. Okay? And science cannot assign meaning to things because, again, that's not what science is. Science tells you about the nature of the world. It doesn't tell you what things mean. Okay? And so I think there is a sense in which we've retreated from religion because, for whatever reason, I think we got out of the practice of confronting these things. Again,
is it because we got out of the practice of confronting them because they became non-confrontational?
I think religious. I think the establishment churches did become non-confrontational. Maybe that's an inevitable
because the doctrines of Islam confront their subscribers quite fervently, don't they?
Well, yes and no. I mean, in other words,
and
technically,
Orthodox,
yes.
Orthodox Jewish practice, that's quite confrontational to the follower.
Well, but wait a minute. I mean, but yes, in theory. But again, we're talking about the practical.
Should I say demanding more than confrontational?
No. Demanding comes. Both of those are excellent terms. I'm just pointing out something that okay. Everyone is facing the problem of scale. You see, one of the things with Islam is that there is no quote unquote established church of Islam, right? So that the problem of scale, like, Catholic, a lot of people don't know that Catholic or Catholic means universal. And so the Catholic Church, for example, was the outgrowth of an attempt to create a universal Christian church. Right away, they were going for big scale. But the thing is that human institutions, right, always suffer from the Tower of Babel problem. This is another place where Jordan Peterson has been really helpful. Yeah. It's like, it's not saying anything bad about religion to say that if you scale the institution too big, it starts to collapse under its own weight. It starts to corrupt itself under its own weight because that's just the nature of things. There's a saying, what is it? Out of the crooked timber of man, no straight thing was ever built. Okay.
Nice.
But what that means is that the larger the structure you do try to build, the more off center it's going to be. Do you see what I'm saying? And if you have a piece of wood that's off true by a little bit, and you're building some short thing, that's one thing. If you want to build a bridge with it, by the time the whole span is finished, you may be 5, 6, 7 feet off the mark, right? So that's just the nature of human institutions, and I think we've again, because the Catholic Church, because the universal church had scale built into it from the first, that was more of a problem for Catholicism. The fact is that, yes, Islam also is uncompromising in a sense. It's totalizing in a sense. On the other hand, look, let's be honest. The Saudi royal family is Muslim on paper. I mean, you can't tell me that they're really devout and they're really, it's like, no, they're not. They're just as venal as any other heads of state. But in the Saudi religious police, for example, they really do have religious police, don't make any claim to a universal Muslim mosque. People it doesn't work that way in Islam. It's like you may have an imam that you emulate, and this imam may be like a regional guy. There may be people in other countries who also emulate that guy, but it's not like there is no, right. So in other words, all these systems, all these institutions are subject to the ordinary laws of human decay and human fallibility. It's just that the scale has different effects on our side because of the structure of Christianity as an international thing, and it's different from international Islam. That's all I'm saying. There is such a thing as a Catholic Church. There is a Vatican, and there is not really a Vatican, in Islam. There's no comparable institution that serves this. There's Mecca, but that doesn't serve the same purpose as the Vatican, you see. So, long story short, I think the scale, I think it really comes down to scale for the most part. And I think that the way we start to fight back, or rather to get back from that, to draw back from the precipice, is to have smaller institutions. The Church of England has shown itself to be useless in this crisis. It's shown its willingness to just belly up to any old bureaucrat waving a pen around. Mm-hmm. I think the answer to that is that people, Christians in England need to look at the roots church, right? They need to look at going back to the roots of Christianity, where the Christians are once again these weirdos on the fringes of a giant pagan empire, and they're kind of like meeting in secret and praying together in secret, singing together in secret, and kind of laying their hands on the sick and ministering to each other in secret if they need to. Like, I think that's a way back. And I think Christianity right now is just it's not weird enough. It's not secret society enough, and it needs to be, because that's where its power is. Of course, that's where its power is, because that's where its roots are. That's where its life is.
Well, that's it. I agree, and that's why it's so difficult for me to unpack the demise of Christianity in comparison to other major religions.
I wouldn't say demise.
No, sorry, the decay maybe.
Yeah. Well, decline, I'd say. Yeah.
Decline, fine. Yeah. Because if you was going to play a game of top trumps, Christianity has got enough, as much religious symbolism as any other religion. It's got as much religious architecture as any other religion. It's got swathes of followers still. Mm-hmm. It's spread across the globe. Mm-hmm. It's a good top trump card. Do you know what top trumps are?
Yeah.
There's America. Mm-hmm. So this is why it's most definitely more a cultural thing. It's a cultural decline than it is a structural decline, I think, with it. Or maybe the two go hand in hand. Maybe the cultural decline causes a structural decline and it speeds it up, because you do not see that type of decline even in Islam in Britain. You don't see that decline, certainly not. I spoke about Orthodox Jews. We have communities in London, and I've had some dealings with them. They came to a activity centre for a summer that I was helping to manage, and that was very interesting. Mm-hmm. And they're muscular,
but
robust religions.
Yeah, but remember
no atrophy present.
Well, but wait a minute. It's not that the religion is Orthodox Jews, for example. I mean, remember that, like, how many Orthodox Jews are there in the world? How many Jews are there? Maybe 10 million?
Yeah,
maybe.
There's not a great top trump card, but they've got other strengths.
Right, but what I'm saying is that scale, we're looking at scale again. Because the fact is, look, I'm sorry, if you go to any, in other words, their institutions have all the same problems as everyone else's human institutions, because they're human beings. They have all the same issues with, yes. With corruption in some synagogues and not in others, and this and that. Because it's a human thing. Now, Islam also has all those same problems, but because we don't know a lot about it, because we don't have people who've kind of penetrated deeply into those organizations, we don't know as much. So we tend to think that there is unity when there is not necessarily. Okay. And by the way, all we have to look, we're talking about the robustness of an institution, of a religion. Well, all we have to do is kind of give the lie to that is to look at the Middle East, look at how conflicted the ground is there. Okay.
I'm not saying their doctrines are robust. I'm saying that they're more muscular, more vibrant.
Well, I would say that I don't know if I'd say they're more vibrant. I would say ours are less vibrant because we have succumbed to the problems that come with scale. We have succumbed to the problem. In other words, for example, you notice, okay, the kind of the coherence of a Pakistani community that has, set up shop somewhere in the UK. But precisely because they are small, they are a minority, okay, in a majority a situation, right?
Well, that's not so true.
Yeah, but wait a minute, just bear with me for a second.
In some parts, okay.
Yeah, but let's right now it still is true, right? It's like they're a minority, okay, and
so they're a majority in the parts of the towns in which they're ensconced.
Well, I'm talking about as opposed to as a percentage of the population of the nation. Okay. What I'm trying to get at is that groups of immigrants, for example, are always going to be coherent within their solitudes. And you could argue that that's a problem, right? In the same way that France has had this problem because it's got these immigrants. They bring the immigrants in. They're not very good at integrating talent. You have all these European governments who've gone down this so-called multiculturalism thing, which means that they're not insisting that people actually assimilate. That is a problem. But what I'm getting at is that because people tend to bunch up when they come to another country, okay?
Yeah.
From the outside, it looks like they are highly, and again, you're not in there talking to people, about their daily back and forth and what have you, and the gossip that happens in the mosque and in the shop and whatever between them. So to you, it looks like they are coherent, and they might in fact cohere more than, the kind of sprawling Church of England majority that because it was the Church of England.
From what I've seen of mosque activity, they look like a far more coherent group.
All I'm saying
they'll bring out small bags of food.
Yeah. All I'm saying is that's a scale issue. It's a scale issue. It's scale and the fact that the Church of England has been a big sprawling majority in England because it was the Church of England. So it didn't have to like in other words, your coherence didn't have to be an active conscious practice. You had a big cold saltwater moat that gave you your coherence, right? And that isolated you from everything else from the continent. Okay. So that was your thing. I guarantee if you go to the slums of actual Pakistan, you wouldn't find that there was any particular coherence between people in the quote unquote Muslim community. You'd find that there was almost none. In other words, they didn't cohere in that way. They cohered on the basis of either these guys are part of the street gang, these guys are part of this family, these guys work for the same business, these guys are part of this political party, what have you. And they'd just be like everyone else if you went
they're all coherent in the way that they all subscribe to the dominant religion.
Yeah, no. Well, yeah, but I'm not talking about that. All I'm trying to point out
is the topography of the society is coherent in and of itself cohered by Islam.
No. I don't think so. Obviously not. Because is the topography of Iraq cohered by Islam? Did Islam keep Iraq together? No, a strong man kept Iraq together. What happened to all of the Muslims in Iraq, which is a mostly Muslim country, when the strong man went away? What happened? They started slaughtering each other. Okay? Now, again, this isn't because they're Muslims, because they're human. Again, right back to Cain and Abel. They went right back to the Cain and Abel story. Why? In other words, across the whole Muslim Middle East, why is that ground so contested? It's contested because it's just like Europe. When Europeans were fighting the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the 7 Years' War. Europe is the most contested ground conflicted ground on earth. Okay.
Yeah.
And the Muslim Middle East, the problem with that place is just that some genius decided to draw some straight line borders on a map and said, okay, you guys live together. You're part of the same country now. And they weren't having it. You know, how many times did they have to redraw the map of Europe? The people, you know, the Slavs would do this, and this happened in the Balkans, and this kicked off over here, and okay, this da-da-da-da, and this guy's going to succeed the throne or whatever, and it's like just, you know, decades, centuries, okay, and the maps in the borders in Europe tend to have squiggly lines. Why? Because they tend to be natural borders. They're rivers, they're mountain ranges, okay, and the Middle East is a mess because the borders are straight lines. And all Muslims who live in that area are like, no, I don't recognize this border. You get back over behind that river like y'all used to do 200 years ago. And so in other words, the coherence that you see as a person walking through a town like Luton or somewhere else in the UK where there have been Pakistani immigrants, that is, I'm not saying it's not real coherence. What I'm saying is that coherence is an artifact. It's an artifact of the fact that these are people coming into a society in which they are not, you could say yet, but they're not the majority. If you simply go to the place where they are the majority, you don't see that coherence. You don't see Muslims, you know, getting along in any Muslim country because they're Muslim.
Would you say that the treatment of females in Islamic countries is consistent?
Consistent with what? You mean consistent across Muslim countries?
Yeah.
No. I mean, it's obviously not. There's you know, even in a single country going between urban and rural areas, you might see a big difference, right? And then, in Egypt, there might be one kind of thing. In Nigeria or Mali, it'd be something else. In Indonesia, the woman will have a certain status. In Saudi Arabia, they'll have a different status, right? So it's not consistent across all those countries.
Let me flip that question and say, would you consider the treatment of homosexuals across the Islamic world to be consistent?
Oh, definitely not. Same thing, right? It's like, Islam seems to, well, let me back up a second. ISIS throwing gay people off buildings and shit like that. I mean, that's one thing, but you don't even have to go as far as that to see that there are these wild fluctuations in how people kind of come to terms with sexual dissidence in their midst. Some of this has to do with, my half-ass theory is that homophobia, so-called homophobia, is actually, has less to do with religion and more to do with tribalism, in that, more is that civilization in the sense of urbanization, in the sense of, ancient Greece being civilized and people who lived outside, being barbaric, or ancient Rome being the civis, right, the city, and people lived outside being barbaric. When you live in, I think that when you live in conditions that are closer to the essentials, put it that way, that is to say, when your society has to carry itself on a ready footing, on a self-defense footing, right? When when you may have to fight off the next group of guys coming over the hill, when you're nomads or what have you, you tend to not have, you tend to appreciate things like traditional masculinity. The men have to know how to fight, right? And they have to defend the women, because if they don't fight and they don't defend the women, if they're not brave, okay, then the next guys are going to come over and kill everyone and take all the women. And that's the end of everyone. Okay. So, those kind of tribal societies, there tends to be more homophobia because there needs to be more homophobia. In other words, they don't have any, like everyone needs to, pick up a weapon or a tool and have babies. And that's just basic across everybody, everywhere. That's just how it is. Okay. And the moment you get into a more, like a more well-defended urban situation, right? You have a professional military, you have like your civilization starts to expand, you have like more infrastructure, not everyone has to pick up a weapon and defend the perimeter. What you find is that very often, those societies become more tolerant of sexual dissidence because there's not as much of an imperative for everyone to pick up a weapon or a tool and have as many babies as possible right now, or we'll all die. And that's actually what you see. That's actually what you see. Ancient societies across the board, irrespective of religion, were homophobic. Why? Because, we don't, what do you mean you're not either, if you're a man, what do you mean you don't like weapons and you're not gonna, I don't know what that means. What do you mean you're not gonna have babies? No. This is survival. So all ancient, as far as I can see in history,
I thought the Greeks were fond of.
Well, yes, but the Greeks had a civilization, right? I mean, in other words, they were able to kind of defend themselves, right? And even like, okay, the Spartans had this kind of notorious thing with the relationships between young men and older warriors, but even then, it was like that wasn't that you could say that was homosexual behavior. But that wasn't homosexuality as we understand. In other words, those young warriors would grow up and get married and have kids, right? So that's my point. Is like I think the kind of there's sexual behavior on one side, but then there's this kind of fear and contempt for male softness, and fear and contempt for any male who is a sexual dissident. Because why? Because there is an imperative that we all have to defend this thing we have. And that imperative starts to go away as the thing you're defending becomes larger and better defended. That's at least, again, in my cursory reading of history, that's what I've seen. So, I think that's definitely a thing. And on the other hand, I would say this, that, there is something about the Western, like in the West now, we seem to be doing the opposite thing. We seem to have decided that it's actively a bad thing, okay, for young men to grow up and fall in love with women and get married and have babies. We've decided that that's now seen as something bad. And that's a real problem, right? Because your population is your wealth. Your people are your wealth. And it's very important for families, what people don't realize is that big societies that tolerate sexual dissidence and that tolerate bohemians and that have the concept of art for art's sake, for example, you only get art for art's sake in a civilization that's big and well defended and has a critical mass of what we might call normies, right? It's you have to have a critical mass of people who believe in the normal things of you grow up, you get married, you get a job, you have babies, and it's only because we have a society with enough of those people that we have kind of the luxury of tolerating bohemians. Oh yeah, these people can go and cut their hair weird and do weird things, whatever on the side. But that's because we have all this infrastructure. We have this system that's maintained by people who get up every day, do what they're supposed to do. And that's, I guess, my biggest kind of gripe with the modern left is that they seem to have this kind of active kind of contempt for normal people, and I really don't like that. It's like it's one thing to say that I'm a sexual dissident, I'm gay or I'm lesbian or what have you, and I insist on, I refuse to be relegated to second-class citizenhood. That's one thing. It's another thing to turn it on its head and say you are the weirdo because you are heterosexual and want to grow up and get married and do normal things. It's like, no. Like Oscar Wilde was the man, but Oscar Wilde couldn't, there was no Oscar Wilde, okay, back when there was druids and Picts and Angles running around the British Isles. He could not have existed in that environment. Oscar Wilde only existed because a bunch of squares, okay, got up every day and did what they were supposed to do. And then he could be Oscar Wilde. You see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying. I think we should leave it there because there's a few things that we could pick up on next time.
Absolutely.
Probably, I would like to talk about, you've just spoken about the left and the right, and how the left is kind of misbehaving its way into a sort of a darker future for us.
Yes.
And the right is capitulating somewhat. So maybe I'll try and get my head around those two facets, those two opposing powers, and then we can chat about that. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, I'd say, I'd say the capitulation of the right is in some ways even more consequential than the maneuvering of the left. I think that as crazy as the left is, I think that the right, the situation is as bad as it is in large part because of a series of kind of catastrophic missteps.
Well, let's hold it there and do an hour on it next time because it deserves that kind of inspection. Mate, definitely. It's been wicked to talk to you. I always learn a lot, and you always give me lots of food for thought, so thank you very much, Mike.
Hey, thank you, brother. I really appreciate it.
And I will see you next week.
All right, man. Take care.
Cheers, mate. Ta-ra. Bye.